to the Mixtape with Scott. This is Scott Cunningham, professor at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. I think we're on either the 91st or 92nd. I think this is the 92nd episode. 3 seasons, 92 interviews. Really fantastic. Thanks so much for coming and listening. Those of you that still are hanging in there and listening to this thing. It's been a lot of fun for me. And I hope it's been a lot of fun for you too. This week's guest is Jesse Rothstein, the Carmel P. Friesen Professor of Public Policy, Professor of Economics at the University of California, Berkeley. He's very, very well-known labor economist. And I won't go into all the superlatives, but he's kind of that, comes from, it's kind of been associated with all the great labor departments, in my mind, a lot of the great labor departments like the University of California, Berkeley, and also Princeton. And so it's, but another thing about talking with Jesse that I was really excited about is he's a David Card student. And as those of you know, not only am I really interested I'm very interested in, the causal inference, intellectual social history, but I'm very interested in the students. I'm very interested in how this paradigm shift moved through economics via the students, not just the people, the people that won this Nobel Prize, but through the kind of work that the students did and the colleagues. And so it was really fun talking to Jesse. That's like a hook for me into talking with people, but it was really wonderful talking to Jesse. We had never met formally. We'd spoken a few times, and I teach his augmented synthetic control paper all the time. And I think it's probably one of my favorite papers in that branch of the synth literature. The synth literature not being nearly as, I guess, it actually is probably getting to be as large as that difference in differences literature. And as both of those, the econometrics of diff and diff and the econometrics of synth continue to evolve, you're starting to see that the use cases for the methods, put aside the econometric of the methods, but the reasons that you would use one of them, it's becoming the case that you could justify the other just as well. The world's getting complicated. The econometric, the causal inference program evaluation is complex. It's complicated. And so anyway, Jesse's written a lot of great papers in labor, education, discrimination, but he's also got these very cool new papers on synthetic control that I really love with Eli Ben Michael and Avi Feller. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope you like this interview. If you do, tell somebody about it. And I'll see you next week. I'm going to turn it over right now to the other Scott Cunningham and from just a few minutes ago, and Dr. Jesse Rothstein. Thanks a lot. All right. Well, it is my pleasure to have with me someone I don't think we talked. We've emailed briefly recently, but I don't think we've spoken. Jesse Rothstein. Jesse, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to see you in person. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, for the sake of the listener, could you tell us your full job title and who pays your salary?
Sure. I teach at the University of California, Berkeley, where I'm the Carmel P. Friesen Chair in Public Policy and Economics.
Oh, okay.
And I also wear another hat where I'm the faculty director of the California Policy Lab at Berkeley.
Awesome. Awesome. I can't wait to talk to you about those things. Okay. Well, let's start with an icebreaker. What's a vacation that you took ever? When you were little, it could have been recently. It doesn't have to have been your favorite vacation. It could even have been your worst vacation, but it's something that you've thought about a couple of times since then.
Interesting. I think a couple of years ago, it must have been 2021, I took my family to Glacier National Park. and
Oh,
that's just a spectacular place. I'd been there when I was like 20, and taking my kids back there was just great.
oh wow.
Just
What'd your
beautiful.
kid, how old were your kids?
They were like, I don't know, 13 and 11 then.
Yeah, what'd they think?
They liked it. They liked it. Some of the hikes were a bit much for them, and we didn't get into the backcountry or anything like that.
Oh,
But one reason I keep thinking about it is because they're gonna have to rename it because all the glaciers are disappearing.
oh, really? What are they going to call it now?
I don't know, but it's gonna be strange to have a glacier national park with no glaciers.
Yeah, that's gonna be a big bummer if you go there and there's
Yeah,
nothing, you can't find any. Well,
yeah.
cool. That's those. Well, that's great. Well, so tell me, where did you grow up?
I grew up in LA, in
Oh,
Santa
okay,
Monica.
okay. What did your parents do for a living?
My dad at the time was a union organizer. My
Oh,
mom did a number of different things, but when I was in high school, she ran a community center that provided a homeless shelter and a battered women's shelter and a number of other kind of
oh.
community services.
So you kind of come from a background of people that are, well, your dad being in working for unions, labor was a big part of your, it's like in your DNA a
Yeah.
little
Yeah. I mean, my parents were part of the 60s New Left.
bit.
I think my mom went to jail in Mississippi for registering black voters.
Oh,
And that
wow.
was that kind of idea that your job is to make the country a better place was kind of part of my growing up.
Wow. 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 That's got to be pretty formative. Did you have any siblings?
I do. I have a younger sister.
Oh, okay. So, so, so what kind of games did you like to play when you were like maybe a little kid?
Yeah. So I know in high school I got into board games with a good friend of mine, a bunch of Axis and Allies, and I forget what all the other ones were called. There were various kind of complicated board games that now my kids are into, and they're way too complicated for me now. But
Yeah.
when I was 14, I loved them.
Yeah. Yeah. Those are great because they're great. They're so social and
Yeah,
they require so much thinking too, but they're so great just being
exactly,
all around the table.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So when you're in high school, when there's not that many things you can do, it's a way to hang out with your friends all day and have a good
Right.
time.
Yeah. 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 That's right. Yeah. Those games also take a long time. So it's a lot of fun just hanging out.
Yeah.
Well, so when you were, around those ages, like middle school,
Mhm.
did you ever have thoughts like, this is what I want to be when I grow up?
I didn't really worry too much about what I wanted to be when I was at that age.
Mm,
I guess I figured it would work itself out, and I didn't really, I didn't know, and there wasn't something I was dying to do,
mm,
and I figured it would take care of itself.
mm,
I was always good at math, and I went on to be a math major, and I knew enough about the world of work to know that that would probably put me in a pretty good place,
mm.
even if I didn't know what I wanted to do.
Yeah, was the math options at your high school pretty good?
I think they were normal. It was a good school, and so I could take calculus, but there
Hmm.
wasn't anything unusual, I think, about it.
Yeah, yeah. What would your teachers, if I could have eavesdropped in the teachers' lounge, what do you think I would have heard them saying about you?
So I had one teacher who complained that I corrected her too much in elementary school. Um, yeah, I don't know. I think they thought I was engaged and bright,
Mm,
but I don't know that any of them would have predicted I'd become an economist. I certainly
mm.
wouldn't have.
Yeah. Had you heard of that kind of thing in high school?
I'd heard of it, but it wasn't. I didn't know much about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I knew growing up I was always interested in policy and politics,
Ah,
and I knew I liked to do math, and it took me a while to understand that this was a way to combine those two. But
you mean like so from early on, it felt a little bit like that would have been picking between things, and so you picked math.
yeah, I mean, not thinking I was going to become a mathematician or that I was going to do that forever, but I liked doing it, and it was something to study in college. And for I One of the reasons I majored in math was a sense that it required fewer courses than a lot of the other majors.
Oh, really?
And so I had already done a good chunk of them by the end of sophomore year. And so I was really done with my major midway through junior year.
Oh,
And that meant I could take all kinds of things. And
yeah.
so I took history and I took literature and philosophy.
Oh, oh, did you take any economics?
I took one economics class in college and hated it.
Was it that EC10 class?
Yep.
You
Yep. It
hated it.
was,
Wow. Was that
I hated
Marty?
it.
Who taught it?
It was Marty Feldstein. I was, I thought of myself, I was fairly progressive
Mm,
politically, and saw economics in the 90s was kind of still at the ascendance of Chicago school style
mm,
economics. The first lecture, Marty gave a lecture about how it was really important to distinguish between positive and normative analyses.
mm.
And this class was going to be entirely about positive analyses, and it wasn't going to make any value judgments. And that was key to economics. And then every other lecture of the semester, he trampled all over that distinction.
Like, what's an example that you really stunned you?
Talking about the importance of low taxes, how we
Uh,
need to lower tax rates, or we need to lower corporate taxes, or free trade.
mm,
Any of these you can talk about benefits. You can talk about costs, and then if you're really just positive, then you leave it to somebody else to decide whether the costs outweigh the benefits. But that wasn't how that class worked.
right,
It
right.
didn't help that the class was taught mostly by the TAs. That's
Mm,
the way it was set up then. And my TA was a Harvard Business School student who wore a Harvard tie every day.
mm,
Not and was very, it just felt this wasn't what I was interested in doing.
hmm. Wow. So then you you take all these math courses and you really thrive. What, so if I could have like, eavesdropped on the math faculty lounge, the
Mm-hmm.
whatever their teacher lounge is, what are they saying about the young Jesse Rothstein, like towards
I
that,
don't
towards the end?
I don't think I even knew who I was.
Uh,
I went through college and didn't really stick my head up. I enjoyed it, and I had good friends and I learned a lot,
mm-hmm,
but I didn't really get to know any of my professors.
mm.
So I wrote a senior thesis, so I guess my thesis advisor on a good day would have remembered who I was, but that was about it.
You didn't think about going to grad school and becoming a mathematician?
No, I was good at math, but I wasn't that good at math, and it was
Uh-huh.
pretty clear, freshman year that I wasn't good enough to do that.
Mm, mm.
And it was never something I aspired to. I wasn't hurt by that. But
Right, right. So towards the end of your time at Harvard, uh, is there some sort of future that you're sort of like zeroing in on?
no, I had still no idea. I remember feeling like, for one, like there were certain kinds of jobs that recruited on college campuses. And at the time, a lot of that was management consulting, but some
Mm,
Wall Street kinds of things. And I knew I didn't want to do any of those.
yeah.
And so I had this resolve that I wasn't going to really even seriously try to look until I graduated
Mm,
for a job. But I remember feeling like that was scary because all my friends knew what they were doing and I had no idea.
mhm,
Um, I applied to do Teach for America and didn't get it, and they
mm.
were right not to take me,
How come?
because I hadn't done any teaching.
Oh,
It wasn't, I'd done some tutoring, but I wasn't, there's no, I don't, I think it was reasonable to conclude that I wasn't the right person for them.
yeah,
It
yeah.
was in the early stages of Teach for America where they were pretty choosy.
I see. I see. So what kind of stuff are you
Um,
looking for? You're looking for, so how would you describe the the reasons you're looking at something like Teach for America? What's going on?
I mean, I'm wanting to do something to explore the world a little bit, and also to get to be helpful.
Mm,
And I thought of, I could explore teaching. I could contribute in some small way and
mhm.
grow up a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so the other things I applied for were all like going abroad. teaching somewhere, or
Oh.
and that's what I ended up doing. I taught English in Japan after college.
Oh, okay. I didn't see that. I thought I saw this
Yeah,
other thing.
my CV doesn't have all of the stuff I did bouncing around after
Oh,
college on it.
okay. So you were teaching English as a second language in Japan.
Exactly.
Yeah. How long did you do that for?
Less than a year. It was one of the it was a it in the days before the Japanese bubble popped. They had a lot of money, and there were a lot of people who wanted to learn English as a kind of a vanity project,
Mm.
and they would hire anybody who'd come do it. If you came from the U.S., you had to have a college degree because that's what it took to get a visa. But
Oh,
there were other people who were doing it from Australia or New Zealand without that.
wow.
Um, and so I was teaching for this company that was mostly entertainment, not really teaching.
What do you mean?
Um, so people would sign up for these lessons and they'd come occasionally. And a lot of the appeal was in a period when Japan was pretty closed, they would get to kind of sit and talk with a foreigner for an hour. And
Mm.
that seemed to be why they did it. If you were really serious
Oh,
about learning the language, there were probably more serious uh, options for that.
yeah. So what did that experience do to you, you think?
I mean, I would say mostly what I got out of it was just living in Japan and being in a foreign country.
Mm.
When I got off the plane there, I had never eaten sushi. I didn't know a word of Japanese. I learned a little bit of Japanese and I learned to like sushi, but it was an experience living in a place where you really couldn't speak the language and kind of navigating your way around.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and I it was not always comfortable, but I got a lot out of it.
Yeah. So you leave, is it always just going to be a 1 year gig or is it like you left prematurely?
It could have been longer, but I had never. There was no promise to go for longer than
Hmm.
I did, and
Yeah.
so I went and checked it out and did it for a while. And there were some people who kind of became lifers, but that wasn't ever on my plan. But I
Well,
didn't know what I was going to do next.
the thing I saw is this
Yeah,
Economic Policy Institute gig as a researcher. What was that? That's
yeah.
after that experience?
That's after there was something else in between, but yeah, that was
Oh,
after
what'd
I.
you do before that?
So I came back in what was it? It would have been kind of late spring 1996. And I thought, well, there's these campaigns going. Why don't I go work on a political campaign?
Oh, okay.
And so I went to some trainings for potential campaign staffers. I got slotted into something that they called voter file manager, which was basically managing a database at a time when the technology made that a hard thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up getting a job in New Jersey as helping to manage the database for
But
the for the for campaigns in
was that like your
96.
first time to be working with data?
Um, in high school, I had a job working at a local nonprofit, kind of hand entering the receipts from their in kind donations. So
Uh-huh.
I kind of built a database, but it wasn't any real. It was really just data entry. So this was the first. This was kind of getting a little bit more involved in it.
What'd you think? How did it feel doing all that stuff?
It was interesting. I mean, the technology was just it's hard to imagine today. If we actually the idea was that the campaigns might want to get a list of voters who met some characteristics so that they could go kind of walk to their houses or send them a mailing. And there was a company that the Democratic National Committee had contracted to build these databases for these voter files for all the states.
Mhm.
And my job was to interface between the campaigns and that company. Uh, and but the company had all the voter files on these giant magnetic tapes.
Mm.
So to even do a query would take several days
Oh.
and so the campaigns would say, well, look, we have a budget of this amount. We want to kind of get a list of voters who meet these criteria. But we don't know if we can meet that budget. And it was basically a week-long process to get an answer from the company about how much that would even cost, let alone to generate the list.
Hmm.
And so I did a little bit of estimating what it would cost, but a lot of being the kind of point of contact for campaigns that were angry that they weren't getting what they needed out of the
Hmm.
database.
What was the cost? It was labor?
The cost to get the list.
Yeah.
I actually don't know where the contractor was getting the costs. I mean, it would have been labor. I assume they were covering the fixed cost of the computing, which was,
Mm-hmm.
this isn't just buying a laptop in those days. They had a
Right.
giant room with these, magnetic tapes as big as I was.
Right, right,
Um,
right. Yeah. So, well, then you end up, so what, so you don't kind of are not, you're not moving in the direction, it sounds like, of like, what, like staying on, working on campaigns or something like that. Was that what you were thinking you might do?
I wasn't really thinking about what a career would be at that point.
Mm,
I I guess I thought I might continue and do more campaigns some, but then I saw the people who'd become lifers, and that was a tough life.
mm,
On these campaigns, when they get going, you're working 100-hour weeks, and you're moving to wherever they need you for 3 months and then moving on. That wasn't something I could see myself doing in the long term.
mm, mm,
Um, so, I did it for a while, and then this, I wouldn't say it was a totally successful experience given all the troubles with the voter file. So it wasn't clear that there was a niche for me
mm,
there. And then eventually, my dad knows people who are at this economic policy institute. He puts me in touch with them. They hear math major who's worked on campaigns and is interested in policy and think that's actually a good fit for what they do.
mm.
Um, and so I ended up getting a job where half of my job was running their computers and half of my job was being a research assistant.
Oh, so what was that like?
It was interesting. I learned a lot. It was kind of my first exposure to how you could do kind of economic policy that wasn't just theory
Mm,
and wasn't was to me felt less ideological. Um,
what do you
at the
mean? What?
time, well, so this was again this dates itself, but at the time it wasn't totally straightforward to kind of spin up the current population survey and run analyses of it. It was an endeavor. And the Economic Policy Institute put out a book every 2 years called The State of Working America, where they basically spun the CPS and did a bunch of tabulations.
Mm,
And it was just getting the facts out. And it was, they were definitely, they came from a perspective where they were worried about declining wages, they were worried about inequality, but they were they were the reliable generator of the facts because they
mm,
had the setup to be able to spin the CPS.
mm.
And that struck me as really useful.
So even though you've got this political philosophy that, because you said you were progressive, that something
Yeah,
about this is refreshing.
yeah, it is.
Huh.
It is. And I like that, actually when I was in Japan, I had read Myth and Measurement. And
Oh,
I'd also
really?
like that as a kind of, hey, there's a different kind of economics than what I had learned in Ec 10.
Huh. Huh. So you were, well, it's funny. I can tell a story where a person is a progressive and goes to Ec 10 and then does not become someone that, and then does not become someone that's more grounded in facts and measurement and getting, they might go in the direction of, uh, you know, deeper in their own political philosophy, but you don't do that.
Yeah, I think I was interested in empirics and
Mm,
in kind of knowing what was true about the world and not just deducing it from theory.
mm, mm,
And again, this was a different era in economics where the empirical revolution hadn't really taken over yet. There was still a lot of economics was still theory without much evidence,
right, right.
and a lot of the empirical evidence was not very good.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. Sure, sure. So you stay there what, a couple of years or 1 year?
like a year and a half. And then I decide, I like this. I can see a future in DC in the policy world. And that's an interesting. That's I can see how I could have a role doing policy
Hmm.
from a kind of wonkish side. Um, but I decide that if I'm going to rise up in it, I probably need to go to graduate school.
Hmm.
I need a credential, and I need to learn. I need to learn some statistics. I knew lots of pure math, but I didn't know any statistics.
Hmm.
I probably literally couldn't have defined a standard deviation at that time.
Hmm.
Um, the and I needed a little bit of economics. And so I decided I was going to go get a master's in public policy as a way of building up those skills.
So so do you apply broadly, or is it one of the, something about Berkeley draws you to it?
I applied fairly broadly to public policy programs. Um, I applied to my mentors at EPI really wanted me to get a PhD in economics. I
Mm,
was not sold at all, but I let them talk me into applying to one PhD program, um,
that was
and a bunch
Berkeley.
of MPP programs. No, that was Harvard. I
Oh,
didn't get
okay.
in.
Okay. That's right.
Um,
Marty Feldstein was like, no, he blackballed. He remembered that kid
who
that.
knows? Um, so, but anyway, I applied to MPP programs and decided I wanted to go back to California, and so
Yeah.
Berkeley it was.
Yeah. Well, so, so your first econ class at Harvard's like, kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth. What's econ like for you that first year at Berkeley?
Yeah. So I get to the public policy program thinking, I'm pretty rusty on my math. It's been a few years since
Oh, you're
college.
not doing it
I'm really gonna have to.
simultaneously. You're doing it like you're doing one.
Not at first. I'm just an MPP. There's no plan for a PhD
Oh,
at all at
oh,
this
you didn't
point.
apply to the econ. You applied just to the
No.
MPP. Got it.
Yeah. And I'm worried that I'm too rusty that I'm going to have to struggle to get ready for these classes because I haven't done math in a few years.
Yeah.
And I walk into the stats class and the professor has read our bios and he looks at me and he says, "Okay, you don't belong in this class. This is not
Hmm.
made for math majors."
Hmm.
Um, because most people get public policy master's degrees have not had a math background.
Got it.
They
Okay.
probably haven't had math since high school. So basically, I then realized, oh wow, I've showed up to this program where my whole goal was to learn economics and statistics, and the courses it's offering are not ones that I'm going to get a lot out of.
Hmm.
Um, and so I end up going over and looking at the graduate courses in the economics department.
This is
Um,
98. This is what, 98?
this was '98.
Okay.
Um, so I sign up for go to the professor who teaches grad micro, and I say, well, look, I missed the first week of classes, but I'm interested because I can't do this in public policy. And he says, well, we had a placement test that you missed, but
We
here
have
you
a
can
what?
take it right now.
We have a
We had
what?
a placement test to let you get into for people who are not in the economics department to get into that class.
Uh-huh.
And he
Which
handed it to
class
me.
was it? Which class was it?
This was grad micro.
Grad micro. Okay. So he's like,
Yeah.
if you want to take grad micro, you got to pass this like placement
Yes.
class. Okay.
And he gives it to me, and I was not planning to take a test that day. I just walked into his office, and I sit down, and I work for like 4 hours on it.
What
And
was
I
it?
at
What
some
it
point I
was
wonder, I don't even remember a lot of
it was just a lot of like constrained optimization stuff that you could do.
that I kind of vaguely knew how to do, but it was a little more applied than the kind of math that I had done in college, and I was
Hmm.
rusty anyway.
Yeah.
So and so I'm not sure I'd ever done a Lagrangian at that point,
Hmm.
because in college, it would be a concrete problem if it was in finite dimensions.
Hmm.
Uh, so anyway, so I sit down, I work for 4 hours. At some point, I think we're probably not supposed to be working this long on this test. And I go back and I said, well, I did some of them, but not all of them. And he lets me into the class.
Oh, he lets you in.
I assume basically if you were serious enough to spend time on it, he was willing to let you do it.
It was a hurdle.
Um,
It
yeah,
was a signal. Got it.
yeah. So I ended up doing that. And then,
So what's that class? Who's teaching that class?
it was Steve Goldman and Chris Shannon
Oh, okay.
in the first
Okay.
semester. So it was a pretty serious theory class. It was Musco Woods
Uh-huh.
membrane, it was and it was a math class, and I could do math classes. And
Mm,
there wasn't a lot of moralizing about policy. It was just doing math. I mean,
yeah.
I enjoyed it and I did well at it.
Yeah.
I knew it wasn't what I wanted to do for a career, but it wasn't such a hurdle to get through as I had thought it would be.
Well, were you hearing any economics or were you hearing math? I mean, what were you, you've not had, you don't have this economics background. So like
Yeah.
what's kind of floating up to the top in that class?
I mean, it's lots of theorems about the equivalence between revealed preference and utility functions.
Mm.
And I could work on that. I didn't see it as all that relevant to, should we have free trade with China? or
Right.
whatever the policy questions were of the day, but it was something I could do.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, and so I worked my way through it. I signed up for the econometrics class.
What'd you think
Kind
when
of
you took that
similar.
class?
I was starting to get interesting. It was still no data.
Right.
It
So
was a
yeah,
linear
yeah.
algebra class. And I think we had to do a couple of applied exercises in a language called TSP,
Yeah, I remember that.
but it
We had
was
to too. Yep.
not anything that was really, there was nothing empirical about it.
Mm,
But that was the first time I actually saw what a regression was. I'd never
mm,
seen a regression before.
mm,
And so I enjoyed that.
mm-hmm.
Um, and then at some point in that year, I went to talk to David Card
Really? That's the first
and
year?
said,
That's like the second.
in the first year, I go to talk to him and say, I'm here, I'm interested in policy, going through these classes. Any suggestions? And he said, well, why don't you work for me as a research assistant this summer?
Hmm.
And that was
You feel like you and
that.
him hit it off immediately? So it's like
Yeah.
how come? What's it like to hit it off with him? What's the
I
kind
mean,
of,
he's just devoted to getting the facts right, willing to spend his, he spent inordinate amounts of time with his students.
mm,
He was willing to kind of help people learn and really supportive, I found.
mm,
And, willing to hire me to do something that he probably could have done in a day. I
mm,
spent the whole summer doing it, but he
mm-hmm.
knew I would learn something from it, and that was fine.
So
So
this is kind of like your first moment of data then.
yeah, I mean, I'd done a little bit of data analysis at EPI,
Yeah.
but yeah, um, at EPI, my big project was inverting input output matrices.
Mm,
Um, but this was I'm actually getting to microdata. He has me doing, put together a data set of stacking a bunch of census data sets.
mm, mm,
Um, at at one point, I go to him. He asks me he says, "Okay, well, now that we've done this, now we're going to run an instrumental variables regression where I don't remember what was the instrument or what was the regression." And I say, "Okay, that sounds great, but I don't actually know what instrumental variables is."
mm.
And he sits down and sketches it out on a piece of paper and spends half an hour teaching it to me, and then I got it. And I don't know that I have the patience to kind of spend that much time with my research assistants teaching them the
Mm,
basics like that.
mm,
But it was great.
hmm. So, I mean, are you getting at that time already, are you starting to kind of feel like you're getting that like local average treatment effect and the potential outcomes, or is it like what kind of things could you tell me that you're noticing now looking back that you're kind of getting from Card or from Berkeley?
I think in that first year, it was really just an ethic of getting the facts right and kind of
Uh-huh.
caring about doing the data right. I wasn't getting any of the formalisms yet.
Yeah.
In my second or third year, I forget, I took an applied econometrics class that Ken Che taught.
Ah.
And that was really where we started to get the kind of formal. This is how you do. This is how you do causal inference.
What
He
do you
spent.
think what is the stuff back then that's making an impression on you, particularly when you're taking Ken Chase class?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's more the we want to get it right than anything particular about methods.
Mm,
I think Ken spent a lot of time on propensity score matching at that point. That was the hot thing.
yeah, right. Right.
Um, and so I think, but it wasn't particularly about the method. It was about, it matters to get it right. This isn't just a game. We want to
Mm-hmm.
get the answer right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think maybe the other thing I was getting at that period was this was also the era of lots of papers with really clever instruments that
Yeah.
probably didn't pass any serious
Mm,
investigation.
mm,
And people would talk about them, but with a fair amount of skepticism. So you kind of learn to have a little bit of to say, hey, look, just because somebody can tell a story doesn't necessarily mean it's right.
mm.
And let's try to figure out how to evaluate it.
Your peers are talking that way. Your professors are talking that way.
I think that's what you hear in seminars, you know,
The
how do we
clever
know this is right
instrument,
kind of thing.
the clever instrument even though it might be replacing okay, so this is, you can tell me if I'll
Yeah.
play a particular character. So you could, I spoke with Orly Ashenfelter and he said, I remember the day when people would run instrumental variables and they wouldn't even tell you what the instrument was. It was pretty
Right.
funny, right? And so you can imagine like, uh, you know, the clever instrument stage being synonymous with this improvement. But you're kind of saying something a little more subtle. Can you tell me a little bit about what you're saying exactly?
Yeah. So I think it was an improvement. Better to be told what the instrument was than to not know what it is.
Right.
And that people put a lot of effort into kind of coming up with one where there was a story behind it that you
Yeah.
could tell.
Mm-hmm.
But it was still a little bit too much in the clever. It was kind of too clever by half, and that was the sense that people had that there's lots of stories you could tell, and
Mm.
some of them, they just didn't seem like they passed a smell test.
Hmm.
Or they might, the story might make sense, but then if you wanted to do it carefully, you'd need to do it a little bit differently, and people hadn't bothered to do that yet.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
it was just a sense that, how confident should we be that these results are right? I don't know yet.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so I can give an example of that from a few years later, but that kind of to me captured the flavor of it. So there were a number of papers that used rainfall in April 1968 as an instrument for whether there were riots after Martin Luther King was killed.
Oh, really? I didn't know
With an
any.
idea, the idea was to try to predict whether a city, what the long-term effect was of riots on kind of urban
Oh,
development.
yeah.
And the theory was that if it rained that week, the people probably stayed home.
Yeah, you can see
Um,
the thing. Yeah, sure.
yeah, and it's a clever idea.
Yeah.
And the rainfall at any given time is reasonably random, and so I think that makes sense. But the at least some of the papers at that point were just thinking regressing outcomes in 1990 on whether there was a riot in 1968 with rainfall as an instrument
Okay.
and no controls. Well, rainfall is not randomly assigned across all cities.
Right. Right.
It's much more likely to rain in April in Memphis than it is in Albuquerque
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
or
Right.
something like that.
Yeah,
And
sure.
so it would have to do
Oh.
that right, to really make that as good as random. What you'd want to do is control for what fraction of Aprils it rains in that city.
Mm, mm.
And if you do that, then it's probably pretty as good as random whether it rained that particular April.
Right. Right. Right.
So it's an idea that could work, but we hadn't really gotten to the point of let's really isolate the randomness yet.
Huh. You're talking
Um,
this way. You're thinking you and your colleagues or your classmates are kind of talking that way. This kind of really scrutinizing the design or scrutinizing the instrument. Is it mainly IV that's getting in your head?
I think that's probably the most common one at that point. Yeah, I think I don't know how much we're coming up with it versus just hearing it a lot,
Mm-hmm.
but I do remember that, Orly visited during one of the years I was in grad school. Hearing it from David, hearing it from John DiNardo, who visited, hearing it
Mm-hmm.
from Hito Imbens, who visited during that period. That I remember hearing a lot of times. Okay, so you're doing this analysis. What's the hypothetical experiment that would identify the effect you're interested in, and how does this analysis you're doing approximate that experiment? And I
That's
that's
different
a,
than the
that's a question I remember hearing from Orly, hearing attributed to Orly as
oh, that's
you're
that
not you're
source is
not getting a
probably
causal
Orly.
effect unless there's an experiment that goes with it.
Yeah. So that's fascinating that's in it just seems like everything seems to go back to Orly Ashenfelter that I've heard.
Yeah,
Uh so again, I just want to try to
yeah.
understand this though. That to me is directly connected. Okay, so why is that not directly connected with the clever instrument?
Well, I think it is, but we hadn't yet gotten to the point. I think that lesson that causation is only really identified by experiments,
Yeah.
by randomization.
Mm.
had not quite fully penetrated into how
Oh,
do you implement it to isolate the randomization.
I see.
And so Orley was asking the question, but it needed to be asked because a lot of
Right.
people hadn't thought about that question at that point.
Yeah. 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 Right. Right.
And clearly the people who came up with the rainfall instrument had that idea in mind, but we just hadn't gotten to the point yet where people realized that it wasn't enough to have the idea in mind. You actually had to isolate the
You
randomness.
had to isolate the randomness. Yes. Yeah. 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 Right. Right. Well, do you think that even is coming from that late theorem? Because, prior to everything being framed in the late theorem, you've just got exogenous instruments. But, the late theorem is got this explicit, independence assumption inside it, which is distinct from the exclusion restriction.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I had really internalized the late theorem yet. I don't know how much that was around, but it was pretty new at that point. And
Mm.
I don't know how much. Well, for one thing, we were always thinking, you weren't ordinarily thinking of heterogeneous treatment effects as the default assumption. It was
Oh,
perfectly normal to kind of think of constant treatment effects
got
at that
it.
period.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Okay. So, so you you end up working, is Card your main advisor?
Card ends up being my main advisor.
What
Yeah.
do you end up working on?
So I ended up writing it. So the one of the projects he had me work on as a research assistant was he did a paper with Alan Kruger on the effect of ending affirmative action in California on Black and Hispanic applications to the University of California.
Mm.
And as part of that project, they got data on SAT takers.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things I did for him was I cleaned that SAT data.
Is that
Um,
your first paper, your Journal of
I
Econometrics?
wasn't Well, so that grew out of that. I was just a research assistant on the Card and Kruger paper. I wasn't a co-author. But
Oh,
at some
okay.
point, I go to David and I say, look, these SAT data are really interesting. There must be, there are a lot of other things you could do with it beyond this question.
Uh-huh.
And he said, well, why don't you go do one of them? And so, tell me what your best ideas are.
Mm.
And the Journal of Econometrics paper grew out of that. It ended up using different data, but it was using SAT data and looking at admissions to the University of California. And then my job market paper was using the SAT data. It was it's called Good Principals or Good Peers.
Oh, yeah, that comes out in
So
AER. Okay.
yeah, that was a
What is that
study of
paper
school
about?
choice. So
Oh, that's
it's
about a
basically
school choice.
saying it's not about an experiment or anything like that. The idea is we have this proposal to let people choose schools.
Mm.
A lot of the argument for it is if you create a market in schools, people will choose the better schools, and that will create rewards for schools that are good, and penalties for schools that are bad, and create kind of market incentives for schools to get better.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about how that would work, and thought, well, a predicate of that whole chain of logic is that when people choose schools, they're going to choose the good ones.
Yeah.
But do parents know what are the good schools? Can they identify them? It wasn't
Mm.
so clear to me. And so I
Because
said, well,
back
let's think
then
about
there
how you
wasn't,
could identify.
well, what would parents have had access to back then?
It's a good question. That was part of
Folklore,
the
just kind
logic.
of like a social network or something?
You were just starting to get some versions of accountability that would you could get average test scores at the school level or something like that,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but they weren't consistently available or very widely available.
Okay.
Um, and I remember one statistic that stuck with me. California had put out its first test scores around this period, where they'd done testing of students and put them out and put out average scores at the school level. And
Mm-hmm.
as part of that, they'd surveyed parents to try to kind of collect some basic demographics.
Mm-hmm.
And so they did this survey that had something like a 50% response rate. And based on that survey, they calculated the average education of parents at the school.
Mm.
And one of the statistics that was buried in the report when you looked at it was that the correlation between the average test score of students at the school and the average parent education was 0.94.
Mm.
And I said, okay, that's a fascinating fact. That says to me that whatever we're picking up here is this really school quality, or is this, or are these test
It's some
scores just
sort of
picking out
sorting.
composition?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is the
And
Tebow equilibrium. It's the sorting.
exactly. Well, yeah. So
Ah,
then so then I realized that, well, look, there's two explanations for that. One is the test scores are just measuring student family background,
right.
and they're just doing it well. And so you got to, so you're not really, it's nothing about the schools at all. It's just which students are at the school.
Yeah.
But the other possibility is that there are good and bad schools, and the parents know about it very well, and the rich and the families with more education are making sure their kids go to those schools.
Yeah. Yep.
And so the causation goes from the school quality to the parental education rather than from the parental education to the test scores. And
Oh,
so my
wow.
job market paper was an effort to disentangle those
Wow.
very indirectly.
What did Card think about that paper while he was watching it emerge?
Yeah. So at first I went to him and I said, well, I've got this idea. And he's like, well, hold on to that, but let's keep looking. Maybe we'll
Uh-huh.
come up with a better idea. But then over the next couple of months, I didn't come up with a better idea. And he said, okay, well, let's see what you can do with that one.
Was he pretty impressed when at the final thing? I mean, is he a
I don't know.
was he a hard professor to impress? Is that even the right word to think about?
Yeah, I don't even know that I would have known to think about whether he was impressed or not.
Hmm.
You know, he certainly gave lots of advice, and it was one of the ideas that I absorbed was that there is no perfect paper,
Hmm.
and that it can always be improved, and certainly my papers can be improved.
Hmm.
Um, and he helped a lot with it.
Hmm.
But he also, as I've gotten to know him better later, he very clearly kind of matches the advising to what he thinks will benefit the student.
Wow.
And there are students, there are papers that might be great in one person's hands, but another student isn't really ever going to be able to pull that off.
Hmm.
And that's okay. You just help the student get to do as well as they can.
Why do you think you in particular really benefit from that style of advising?
I don't know. I think at the time I didn't have that much imposter syndrome about it. I
Hmm.
was I knew I could learn, and I knew I had a lot to learn, and I didn't, somehow, for whatever reason, my ego just didn't get caught up in it as much as it does to me in other settings, or it does to lots of students. And so I could hear the criticism and take it as constructive and not be bruised by it.
Hmm. You
And I don't
mentioned
know what about that setting made that work, but it worked.
imposter syndrome. That's interesting you bring it up. A lot of people would be amazed to think that you would ever feel that, but that you're saying that did start to that at later it's something that you did feel a little bit.
Earlier and later, at various times, I felt it in various settings, but I somehow, maybe because I had never really planned to get a PhD, I just wasn't that emotionally invested in it,
Yeah.
and if it worked out, great. If it didn't work out, there were other things I could do,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
wasn't. I could somehow take in critique and suggestion without feeling bruised by it.
Right. 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 So you end up at Princeton. I mean, what was it like? What was your years like there? I mean,
Yeah,
a lot of really great publications while you're there. How did the whole process feel?
yeah. I mean, that was the mothership. If you were a David Card student, the kind of, it was clear that you were being steeped in this tradition that had started around the counter at the industrial relations section at
Yeah,
Princeton.
totally. Totally.
Um, and so,
Do you have a
all
sense of
the,
the history when you got there? Did you have a sense of the
yeah, yeah, I did. I mean, I don't
Hmm.
know that I knew all of it, but Dave had spent a year on sabbatical there when I was a grad student, and so I spent a semester as a grad student there and
Oh.
kind of got a sense of it. And so I knew the people a little bit when I got hired back there.
So what?
Um,
Orly's there, Kruger's there. Is David Lee
Orly,
there?
Kruger. No, David Lee is at Berkeley. He gets hired at Berkeley towards the end of my time in grad school.
Okay.
Um, the CC Rouse is there, Hank Farber, Jeff
Oh.
Kling. Um, and then, my first year there as an assistant professor, Alex Moss is on the job market. So
Mm.
he's around. Um,
So y'all
it
become
was a great
close.
place.
You and Moss become close? I know y'all have written a
Yeah,
few times together. He was
yeah.
so y'all overlapped a little bit.
He and I keep switching places, but we're now finally in the same place. It's great. So we overlapped for his last year of grad school, my first year as a professor. Then he gets a job at Berkeley
Yeah,
and comes out here.
yeah.
Um, then around in 2009, we both take jobs in the Obama administration. He's in the Department of Labor, and I'm at the Council of Economic Advisors.
Ah,
Then at some point, he gets hired away from Department of Labor to OMB, and I get hired into his job at DOL. And then when we leave Washington, he goes to Princeton, and I go to Berkeley.
yeah.
Um, so,
So
but
you
now
made
we
a
finally got him
promise to
back
him.
to
You're
Berkeley.
like, if you come here to Berkeley, I promise I'll probably stay here this time.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the way it's worked out.
Right.
Um,
Right. Well,
so
so this paper, Tipping and the Dynamics of Segregation with
yeah,
Card and Moss, that's a very, very cool paper. Can you tell me where this paper came from?
sure.
And what's
So
the like,
Dave,
for the sake of the listener who doesn't know what it
yeah,
is, also you can say it also what the origin and what it's about.
sure. So Dave and I had been working on residential segregation and school segregation, and we have this paper on segregation and test score gaps,
Mm-hmm.
which in in modern terms, I guess maybe you could think of it as we're basically using city segregation as a measure as a instrument for exposure to students of a different race.
Mm.
Is roughly what the setup is.
Hmm.
Um, but we've obviously been thinking a lot about kind of neighborhood composition and how that varies across places. We've done a lot of building of segregation measures. And at some point, we have a conversation, and he calls me up and he says, look, I just had this. I've been talking with Alex, and he just showed me this fantastic graph, and we should do something with it. And
Hmm.
the graph was they took neighborhoods in Chicago over a 10-year period, and they plotted the kind of fraction black in the neighborhood in the base year on the x-axis and the change in the fraction black over the next 10 years in the y-axis.
Hmm.
And you can see in that graph, it's just a scatter plot, but you can see a clear discontinuity.
Hmm.
And that, we don't really have a great story for it, but that's basically the origin for the paper. It's noticing that in a lot of places you see that there's a discontinuous relationship between the racial composition of a neighborhood and what happened thereafter.
Hmm. What was the
And
outcome? What was the outcome around the discontinuity?
so the change in the white population over the next 10 years, say.
Oh, got it. Segregation you're watching, and what's the cutoff? It's the running
So
variable is what exactly?
the fraction black in the neighborhood in the base year,
Oh, and then there's a
or the
tipping.
fraction. Yeah, exactly. And so this discontinuity is tipping, that it seems like as
Oh.
long as the black share doesn't get above a certain point, then you get kind of growth in the white population. But if the
Mm.
black share gets above that point, you get fairly catastrophic declines in the white population.
You find this point to be the same in a lot of areas, or is it varying a lot?
We now start to dig into it, and we find that it does vary some across places, but that it does look like each city has a pretty clearly defined point.
What is it? Like,
And
what's an
we
example?
so sometimes it's like 8%, sometimes it's like 12%.
Huh.
And part of the paper is doing an analysis of where it's higher and where it's lower.
Yeah.
Um, and we connect it to there's a lot of sociological discussion about white flight, about tipping points. Schelling's old model of tipping points was
Yeah.
a model of neighborhood segregation.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of these papers, a lot of these stories have this idea that there is some threshold, and if it gets beyond the threshold, the kind of white families get uncomfortable. And it looked like
Mm.
we had empirical evidence for that.
So what are
Um,
you going to look at the outcome? You're looking at segregation coming from the tipping.
yeah, we're looking at changes in neighborhood composition. I think of segregation as an aggregate statistic,
Yeah.
but we're looking at this neighborhood. If this neighborhood goes above the threshold, what happens to it?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And I think it's something that we now talk a lot about pre-specified research designs.
Yeah.
Nobody would have pre-specified this design, because even if you believe the Schelling model, there wasn't wasn't obvious that the point would be common across lots of different neighborhoods.
Yep, yep,
And if the
yep.
point varies a lot heterogeneously,
Hmm.
then it's going to be very hard to see the kind of patterns we see. And so
Yeah,
we
yeah,
never would
yeah.
have said, let's go look for these patterns. But we saw these patterns and they were
Mm.
pretty interesting and pretty consistent.
Hmm.
And so we worked on trying to basically to document that they were there.
Yeah. Did you
That's
face
what
a
the
lot of
paper.
opposition in getting that paper published or getting people to feel persuaded by it?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's basically a descriptive paper. It's just showing that this pattern exists. We're not making causal claims about it, really. It's just
You're not making
here's
a
a model
causal
that
claim,
generates this.
even though it's kind of
I
got
don't
this
think
RD flavor to it.
it's kind of got this RD flavor to it, but we didn't. This wasn't something where we had a program and we were looking at
Yeah.
which side of the discontinuity you're on. We were saying, hey, look, the data show a discontinuity,
Mm.
and we're not. And that was basically it for the paper, showing the data showed a discontinuity.
Mm.
Um, so I think of it as more descriptive than really a kind of causal analysis. You could interpret it as saying, look, it does look like there's some causal effect of going across this threshold.
Mm.
And we kind of, a lot of the methods we used were basically trying to show that they would work, the kind of standard causal techniques would work for this.
They would.
But yeah, yeah. So like one of the worries you have is that, well, if you're looking for where the threshold is as a place where things change, then it might be too easy to find the threshold because things, just random variation will make it look like there's a change point somewhere in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
And so we drew on there's a literature in time series on change points and
Mm.
on identifying change points, and we drew on that to kind of as a way of kind of trying to reason about what the kind of false discovery problem would be in this study.
Oh, wow.
Um, we ended up doing a split sample. You can think of it as split sample IV
Uh-huh.
to do it, where we estimate the change point at one sample, and then use the other sample to test it to try to avoid
Oh.
again finding spurious relationships.
Oh, wow. Huh.
Um, so it was a fun paper,
It was a fun
but
paper.
yeah, but it's definitely not. It was not a conventional program evaluation, and I think a lot of
Mm-hmm.
the challenges we had with it were in trying to figure out what are the right tools to use in this for this. How do we even kind of frame this as a paper, given that it wasn't
Well,
the
so
question wasn't quite as clearly defined as it might be in a program
15
evaluation.
years later, you've had all this time to think about it. What do you think this paper's lasting value is then? What do you think you've learned from it, or that you think there really was something I personally was changed and learned this from it?
Yeah, I mean, so again, I think that we really did have real evidence that there was something important about segregation, about composition affecting people's willingness to live in a neighborhood. And I do think it's
Mm-hmm.
still pretty strong evidence of that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think so I think it's valuable on the substance. I think there was also, you know, methodological things that I took away from it. I think we were one of the first papers to try to do what amounted to regression discontinuity in a setting where we had to estimate where the discontinuity was from the data.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
And I think we developed some tools
And
for
that's where
that.
you're doing this kind of time series thing to rule out these false discontinuities
Well, both the time series and the split sample thing.
and the split sample thing.
Yeah, actually, there's a story about that. That we knew we had this problem, that there was this possibility that you could find a discontinuity even if there wasn't one, just because if you search over all the points, it's like a false discovery problem.
Yeah.
Um, and there's somebody, I forget who, but somebody suggested we go look at Bruce Hansen's papers on this.
Mm.
And so we go look at a bunch of papers, and there's one that's called like sample splitting as a solution to the kind of, I don't know, to some problem. I don't even remember the name of the title.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that title and I think, oh, that's great, that's perfect. Why don't we just do that? We could divide the tracts into two halves and use one half to identify where the tipping point is, and then the other one to test whether there's actually a discontinuity there. And later I'm on this call with David, and he's like, "Yeah, well, that's not what that is about at all. He's not. It's really about trying to split a time series into a pre and a post period. It's a totally different exercise, but it's not a bad idea. And so we
That's a
ended up doing
very
both.
like modern approach. I mean, that's kind of this, isn't that sort of like the stuff you see in the causal forest and the double D bias machine learning, these sort of splitting these things up like that? But you were doing
Yeah.
it, you almost found it by, you were doing it by accident.
Yeah, I mean, we weren't the first to come up with that idea. I
Sure.
think it showed up in some of the two sample IV papers that
Mm,
Kruger and others were doing in that period.
mm,
But yeah, I think it was relatively new at that point.
mm. Well,
Um,
I'm curious about this lab, the California
yeah,
Policy Lab.
yeah,
What is this lab?
yeah. So it's an effort to pair research expertise from the University of California with state and local public agencies in California who have data and have important research questions that are important to kind of doing to policy, but who don't have the research expertise to kind of do it themselves.
Hmm.
And so it's
Whose idea
it
was
was
this?
so it's hard to know exactly where ideas don't, nobody wrote it down first and then everybody else went from there. So it's some kind of joint development of me, Till von Wachter, our two executive directors, Evan White and Janie Roundtree, and program officer at the Arnold Foundation, who
Mm,
all, some combination of us in various conversations over the first few months, kind of figured out what it would be.
mm,
Arnold was then funding a bunch of policy labs, which was an effort to do this, to try to kind of create the opportunity to do quick turnaround program evaluation work for government to try to help improve policy.
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
we saw an opportunity in California where California was miles behind the rest of the country in terms of making use of its administrative data.
mm,
But we saw that, in the wake of the tech boom here, there was more interest in data driven policy and more
mm,
interest in making use of the data. It was also There were also technological changes that made it possible that it was no longer. It used to be that government agencies would each have their data in a kind of custom database that was a different format from every other agency's database, and there was no way to get the data out.
mm-hmm,
And we realized that by this point, it was you now could get the data out, and it was relatively easy to kind of extract data and link it across agencies and things like that.
mm,
And so it
mm,
was an opportunity to build this capacity for the state.
mm,
And then I guess I'd say another piece of the origin story is a perception that it was increasingly the case that the way you were successful as a PhD student was not by having a good idea, but by finding somebody who would give you data that nobody else had.
mm,
And that didn't seem good for the profession at all, or good for research. It
mm.
meant that we were rewarding connections, not ideas.
Right.
And
Right.
so part of it was an effort to try to create data as a public good,
Mm,
a way to build data resources that students could use without having to have had those connections themselves,
yeah.
and that would benefit the state.
Hmm. How has it been? What has it felt like being a part of this thing?
It's been exciting. I think we were right that there was openness to doing this kind of work in California, that there was a need at the agency level to have some research support,
Yeah.
and that the technological barriers weren't going to be a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
We were right that there was demand from the academic side.
Mm-hmm.
There's still a lot of work to do. It's still harder than it ideally would be to develop data use agreements and to kind of get data linked
Mm-hmm.
and to and you know I've increasingly realized just how many different agencies data is split among, and how many
Mm-hmm.
you need to kind of work with to be able to build the data set you'd want for a project you want.
Mm-hmm.
But we've been building towards it, and I think we've done some interesting work along the way.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Um, I was going to talk to you about augmented synthetic control, but I've been talking to your ear off for an
Yeah.
hour, and I wanted to just kind of conclude. Um,
Okay.
so if you could go back in time and maybe
Hmm.
talk to that student who's getting nauseous in their own exposure to their own EC10, uh,
Hmm.
and you sort of could pull them aside. What do you think that what do you think you would tell that kid back then, that from your heart, what would you tell that kid?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that I would tell them that I think is still true is that economics is a lot more interesting than Econ 101.
Mm,
I think we take all of the interesting things about it out to try to make it seem like a simple story.
yeah.
And I think that's a shame.
Hmm.
And so I still think we need to work on Econ 101 and trying to make that better reflect the real world and the what economics really is.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but so that's one thing. But I, you know, for me, it worked really well to not be so worried about coming up with a path ahead of time.
Mm,
And I think it's fewer students seem to be willing to do that these days,
mm,
and I think the world's made it a little bit harder to do that. You know, I don't know that I could have gotten into a PhD program these days without having spent several years building up the resume for it.
sure, sure.
Um, and that's a shame.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. That's great.
yeah,
Well, it's been really nice. I
yeah, it's nice talking to you.
I hope that our paths cross in person and then get to say hey.
Yeah, I'm sorry I talked so much when we didn't get to synthetic control. That's
Yeah, no. Well, I teach it now all the time, and I've really, really
great,
loved it. Um, I've really it's
great.
packed full. That augmented synth paper is packed full of really interesting stuff, especially the old bias adjustment from Abity and Embeds.
Yeah,
It's very cool.
yeah. Thanks, thanks.
Yeah,
That's my favorite way of thinking about it. There are lots of ways of thinking about it, but I think of it as it's adjusted for observables.
yeah, yeah. It's weird. I mean, it comes full circle. And I'm getting better at teaching it, but I'm curious. I mean, have you had a lot of positive responses to it? Do people? It's got a lot of citations.
Yeah, it's got citations. People seem to be finding it useful.
Yeah,
You know, it's amazing how much demand there is for a method that works in this setting. And
right.
so I think, you know, I'm still worried that a lot of the settings where we're using it are not settings where we really have a plausible case that we're going to identify causal effects.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
They're
sure.
not very promising settings, but they're settings where we really want to estimate something.
Yeah.
And I'd rather,
I wonder if I've been teaching it wrong a little bit because I think I started out really drilling on this negative weighting and not be like, kind of like the least negative. But the more I've
Mhm.
really linked it back to that Abity and Embens 2011 paper, it just if then it just starts fitting with this overall imperfect fit so much
Yeah,
better. I mean, you can see the negative weighting, but if you lead with the negative weighting and you don't really think in terms of this like estimating of this potential outcome bias or estimating this estimating this bias using it's estimating the bias using the control group in the
mhm.
post-treatment period, right? So it's just like it. it's just
It
it's just
is.
like it.
It is. And you know, the connection is you only get that bias because you're not willing to accept negative weights in the initial.
Exactly, negative weight. I mean,
Otherwise, if
yeah,
you accept a negative weight to begin with, then you get perfect balance on the observables.
yeah, 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 yeah. You know, I am kind of curious a little bit. I mean, it does feel like when I've spoken with Alberto, um, I don't really understand very well in my own words why it ever was the case that we needed that convex hull. So it's like what I don't really fully understand is like, is it coming from, do you think it's coming from some sort of important principle? Because I mean, even in your method, it's funny, like it's not as negative as it could be.
Right.
So there's like
As
what
negative as it could be is
exactly?
OLS, basically.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. You could always get it, like you could always get the fit better. So like
yeah,
there must be what is going on with this, like, because it's not the same negative weighting you're hearing about with diff and diff. It's this negative weighting of the donor pool unit. And I'm just kind of
yeah,
curious, what's your thoughts on that?
yeah. So I guess the analogy I would draw is we still find kind of matching style estimators
Yeah.
attractive. Even when
Mm-hmm.
you have propensity scores and you can do propensity score weighting, there's something attractive about the intuition about being able to match and say,
Yep.
look, we have a treated observation and here's its statistical twin.
Mm-hmm.
Compare those two.
Mm-hmm.
And but matching is we're only going to allow weights that add up to one and are all
Right.
positive.
Mm-hmm.
And in matching, you typically would be equal weights.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, and so there's something attractive about that,
Mm-hmm.
about not just throwing it into x prime x inverse x prime y and letting that go with it, letting that
What do you
run.
think is the attractive part? The fact that we're using comparable units, that something like that, or what is it exactly?
Well,
Because
it's
negative
I
weighting
mean,
kind of could take, the whole thing with negative weighting is it's like it's kind of maybe taking you a little bit far away from your treated unit a little
yeah,
bit.
yeah. So I think the when you boil down the math behind that intuition, I think it's that extrapolation is dangerous.
Yeah,
And
right.
that anytime you're doing negative weights, you're basically trying to use the relationship within the control observations to
Mm-hmm.
extrapolate outside them,
Mm-hmm.
outside of that convex hull.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if you saw a regression where you were controlling for X, but the distribution of X in the treated group and the control group were wildly different from each other, you'd
Mm-hmm.
be pretty worried about that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You'd be
Right.
worried that we can't really successfully control for X.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that's the issue that comes up here.
Hmm. A lot of, it's funny, a lot of this stuff shows up, it just keeps showing up. I mean, matching, needing common support, synthetic
Yeah.
control needing this balance, regression, under unconfoundness, using functional form to estimate counterfactuals. And here, you're it's kind of, well, you're using an outcome regression, you're using an outcome model to get those, to estimate that bias, right? So you are doing that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think of it as, you know, I'm 25 years into my career and I'm still learning
Yeah.
more things about OLS.
I know.
And we're still understanding OLS better. And all of these
Yeah.
are just different ways of understanding what OLS does and doesn't do.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yes, we are having to extrapolate, and we are doing some of that. But I think we see this is the minimum extrapolation you need to do
Yeah.
to
It's
control for
beautiful.
X.
It's really beautiful. I love teaching it.
Thanks.
I love because
Thanks.
it's like it just sort of the way I teach it just kind of seamlessly fits. And it helps you kind of immediately, and you kind of realize um you're probably going to need to be open-minded to this, because otherwise certain questions will never be answered.
Exactly.
You know.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, Jesse, so much fun to talk. I
Yeah, it was
really
nice talking
loved
to
it.
you too.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. I'll talk to you
Thanks
later.
a lot.
See
Take
ya.
care.